Okay, guys, this is where we left off last time, and we are talking about Christianity and why it became popular, why people found it appealing. So, if you're looking up here at the screen, those four little sub bullets under strong appeal right there to lower classes, basically they can be summed up in one word, which is inclusive. If God doesn't care if you're male or female, rich or poor, where you come from, who your daddy is. God loves everyone. Anybody can go to heaven. And then notice there's no special kind of diet. Okay, you don't have to change the way you do things. Um, the circumcision thing, people understood that was something, a practice that Jews did, which understandably makes it difficult for especially adult men to want to convert over to Judaism. They understood that Christianity was coming out of Judaism, that Jesus himself was Jewish. So people were a little bit concerned that they might have to undergo that procedure to become Christian. And Paul, to his credit, Paul told them, don't worry about circumcision. Don't worry about your diet. Go ahead and eat whatever you want to eat. You can, pork, whatever it is. His goal was to spread Christianity. It wasn't to focus on minutia like diet and circumcision and things like that. And so he really made Christianity as inclusive and as least restrictive as possible. And so he was a great salesperson in that sense. Now the Romans, they from the get-go tried to squash Christianity, in part because Christianity was a pacifistic religion. The early Christians would not fight. Rome was a militaristic society, very masculine in that sense. Warrior society. They were constantly on the warpath, grabbing more land, fighting with other peoples, and the Romans did not want that ideology of philosophy of pacifism to catch on, because then who would be soldiers in that case. And so they saw the early Christians as being kind of cowardly because they would not fight. And another thing was that, and this is something my Christian students sometimes have a hard time with, because as Christians you learn how horrible the Romans were to Christians, and that makes you think that Romans were horrible to anybody who had a different religion from their own, and that's just simply not true. Typically, the Romans could care less what your religion was. Okay? Back then, most people were polytheistic, and so bowing their head towards the emperor was no big deal, because it was simply another god, and it wasn't difficult for people to do. But Christians refused to bow their head towards the emperor. Now you might wonder, well, wait a minute, what about the Jews? They wouldn't bow their heads either. They're monotheistic. They don't believe the emperor is a god. That's true. However, Romans recognized Judaism as an ancient religion. It was older than the Roman Republic, and so the Romans had grown up as a civilization with Judaism, and they respected it as a religion. They understood that Jews are monotheistic and they're not going to accept the emperor as a god, and so basically the Romans gave Jews an exception. So it was okay for Jews not to bow their head, but Christians, on the other hand, this was a brand new religion, and people, when you just discover a brand new religion that no one's ever heard of before, you think of it as a cult. And that's exactly what the Romans saw Christianity as. They saw it as a cult, and they had no respect for it. And so they weren't about to grant Christians an exception to bowing their heads towards the emperor. They considered that to be treason. And your earliest Roman emperors, some of them like Caligula and Nero, these are some pretty twisted individuals. If you want to look up their behaviors and so forth, it's some pretty nasty stuff. But when it came to Christians, they had horrible ways of persecuting Christians. And partially for entertainment value, they would come up with all kinds of different ways of killing them publicly. And so you've probably heard about Christians being fed to the lions and tigers in front of in the Colosseum. They did that. They sometimes, as horrible as it is to say, they boiled them alive sometimes. Nero famously had Christians staked out in the Colosseum, and then had tar poured on their bodies, and then he lit them, had them lit on fire. They look like candles burning because it takes a long time for tar to burn like that. And so, but the Romans believed that by doing this kind of thing, it would discourage people from becoming Christian. They also believed that it would reveal the Christians to be the cowards that they saw them as. Because again, they're pacifists, they don't fight. They saw them as being cowards. But it backfired on the Romans though, because the Romans in the stands, instead of seeing Christians begging for their lives and trying to revoke their just basically revoke their religion, they instead they went to their death as martyrs. They went to their deaths very bravely, and Romans in the stands saw these Christians, facing lions and so forth, and being burned alive and tortured, and but yet not giving up their faith. And so that impressed them. They were like, wait a minute, we were told these people were cowards and sissies and would beg for their lives. They're not doing that. They're actually being very brave, probably braver than I would be if I were down there with those lions. And so it backfired on the Romans and the Roman leadership, and people started to accept Christianity because they saw it as, wow, that it actually gives you strength in that sense, and a sense of character. And so ironically, look here, roughly 300 years after the Romans tried to squash Christianity, Christianity is adopted by a Roman emperor himself, Emperor Constantine, and he issued an order. Now there's a vocabulary word you need to know. That word is edict. Okay, an edict is an order, like a ruling, a decree that comes from a king, an emperor, and this particular one was called the Edict of Milan, and in it he basically ordered that authorities no longer persecute Christians. Instead, he actually legalized Christianity, and then he himself converted. And when people saw that the emperor had converted, that encouraged them to convert. And then shortly after Constantine passed away, a subsequent emperor actually makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so it's kind of ironic that Rome goes from trying to squash Christianity to kind of being squashed by Christianity in a sense. Christianity conquers the Romans. And that's why it's referred to as the Roman Catholic Church. The Catholic is an old word for universal. So for a very, very short time, pretty much anybody who was a Christian was Catholic. There weren't your different denominations like there are today, and so forth. And Roman because it was Rome. Now look here, you've got a map, okay, and notice the different shades of gray represent geographic areas that Christianity had spread to by that date. And so we're focusing on 400 AD here, or 400 CE. And the question is, why do the borders of Christianity so perfectly align with the borders of the Roman Empire? Well, that's because wherever you had the Roman Empire, you had Christianity. It had become the official religion. So if there's Rome there, there is Christianity there. There's the Roman Catholic Church right there. Now here, this map shows you where Christianity was in 325, the green areas. So you can see it doesn't cover all of Europe. You've got these pockets of green. But then 150 years later, it's pretty much everywhere where you see the light purple. Okay, so it spread pretty quickly over 150 years from the time that Constantine converted to 476. There, that's around the time that the Roman Empire is collapsing. Now, you can see all the different arrows right there. All those arrows represent the journeys of Paul. Again, Paul was a person who was taking this new religion on the road and trying to sell it, okay, trying to spread it. And so he's leading from, if you see where it says Syria over there in the Eastern Mediterranean, Jerusalem, that was the birthplace of Christianity right down there in Jerusalem. And you can see most of his arrows leave from there, and then they head westward, especially like up to Turkey, and then he does a lot there in Greece, in the Greek Isles. And so when you hear that Paul spoke to the Gentiles, well, that basically the Gentiles are the Greek speaking peoples, and they're the ones who first converted over to Christianity. And then you see the last arrow, it heads to Rome, and you notice that it doesn't leave Rome for, we just discussed. Unfortunately, Nero had him executed there in Rome. Okay, so some things to remember about the time period here. So remember, civilizations in period two are much larger in the classical period. They're much larger than those that were in period one, the River Valley period, because of iron. Also, your political leaders, like emperors, they saw advantages in expanding. And when you expand your territory, you can grab more resources, which unfortunately also meant slaves. The Romans were very, very big in grabbing slaves, especially from, like, say, Eastern Europe. Um, the Chinese often expanded to grab more farmland. Now, patriarchy is still the norm. Men are still in charge. Men are still ruling, calling the shots, and that continues from period one. And agricultural economies. Now, let's make sure you understand what we mean when we say agricultural economy. What we mean is that your vast majority of people are farming for a living. Okay, so like say 90% of your population is doing some kind of farming. Only 10, maybe 20% in some areas are doing something else, like being a merchant or a fisherman or some kind of a scholar, political leader. So that would be a very small percentage of people. The vast majority of people are farming. So that's what we mean by agricultural economy. The economy is mainly focused on farming. Okay, Hinduism and Judaism, they continue from period one. Okay, those are both ancient religions. Nobody really agrees on exactly when they got started. There's debates over that, but they are very, very, very old, each of them, and so they continue into the classical period. Um, you have to know your trade routes. Okay, you guys did a pretty good job on the SAQ by talking about the Silk Road, but that was the only trade route you mentioned. And so you also need to be aware of the Indian Ocean, the Trans-Saharan trade route across the Sahara Desert there in Africa, and the Mediterranean Sea. And also keep in mind, like, some examples of things that are traded or that move along these trade routes. So, for example, the Silk Road, obviously silk. That's pretty easy right there. But also things like spices, okay, and luxury items. And then Buddhism. Don't forget about Buddhism. You guys did a pretty good job talking about Buddhism spread from India to China along the Silk Roads via missionaries, Buddhist missionaries. The Indian Ocean, you're about to read a lot more about that, but the Indian Ocean is going to help spread things like cotton and bananas and sugar. Unfortunately, slaves as well. And then in period three, and you're actually reading about this right now in chapter two, Islam. Islam is going to spread via the Indian Ocean. The Trans-Saharan trade route, that's going to be mainly gold, salt, and slaves. Unfortunately, slaves. Um, and then the Mediterranean Sea. You already saw Christianity spreading through the Mediterranean Sea. You saw Paul's journeys right there. But then you've got products, okay, such as wine, olive oil, wheat. There's many things that are spread around the Mediterranean. All right, moving on. You got two major religions that developed during period two, which are Christianity and Buddhism. Okay, so you got one Western religion, one Eastern religion. It starts in South Asia but moves quickly into East Asia. Um, Pastoral nomads, they helped bring the time period to an end. Then, especially the Hun, they were also known as the Xiongnu there in China. And so these different groups of the Hun attacked the Guptas, they attacked the Han and the Han dynasty, and the Romans as well. Okay, so we'll get into just a little bit here on politics, the P on spice, and structure and function of states, and then we'll call it a day here. Um, and so, then we'll continue tomorrow. So over in the Roman Republic, now this is before Rome became an empire. You had two groups of people, two classes. You had the plebeians, that's the lower classes, the common people, and then you had the patricians. They are the upper class noble type people, the landowners, and they're the ones who called the shots and ran the show. Well, the the patricians managed to annoy the plebeians, which there's always more poor than rich, and the plebeians rose up in rebellion because the the laws were not written down, and they were tired of the patricians changing the law, changing the rules kind of at their whim, and the plebeians had no clue what the actual laws were. It's kind of like when you play a game with a little kid, a little toddler. They invent a game. It's their game, and they always win. Why do they always win? Because they change the rules as they go, so that to favor themselves. That's exactly what the patricians used to do back in the Roman Republic, until the people revolted, the plebeians revolted, and so the plebeians forced the patricians to agree to actually write the laws down. And that's what the 12 tables were. They were the laws written down by the patricians so that everybody could see them and you couldn't just change them whenever you wanted to. Okay, the civil service exam, we've been talking a lot about that. Remember, that's the thing that's based on Confucianism. And if you want a job working in the Chinese government as a bureaucrat, you had to pass the civil service exam, which meant you had to know everything that there was to know about Confucius. So every Chinese bureaucrat was a Confucianist scholar. Now, a similarity between the Roman Empire and Han China is that they both had bureaucracies. Now, that's one of your vocabulary words, so you should look that word bureaucracy up. But basically, a bureaucracy is when a government divides itself up into departments, and these departments focus on particular issues or topics, okay, or needs, and then the people inside those departments specialize, okay, and so it's all done for efficiency. And so, for example, you go to the post office and you've got postal workers there, and they know everything there is to know about the mail system. If you go to the Department of the DPS, okay, to get your driver's license, well, the people there, they focus on all things related to driver's licenses and driver safety and so forth. Okay, and so, but they're all government bureaucrats, though. They get paid. They're paid by the state. They work for the state. Um, so they both had bureaucracies. Now, notice the difference. So you should put a star by this. The difference here is that China's bureaucracy was much larger than Rome's, in part because the Romans, they focused more on written laws. You don't need as many bureaucrats when you have things like the laws written down and people know what the laws are. Whereas in China, now they did have things written down. I want you to think that they had nothing written down. They did have some things written down, but in China, they relied more on experts, these civil servants, these bureaucrats, to tell people what to do. And so that was the reason why China's bureaucracy was much larger. They didn't rely upon the written word as much as the Romans did, and that's going to be important because that's going to later on that's going to change or affect the way we do things in the West as a way compared to the way they do things, say, in the East. Okay, we're going to stop there today, guys, and then we'll pick up here tomorrow. We'll continue with some politics tomorrow.